Hi everyone, in this video we're going to look into different types of active transport. Now under active transport we have a different range of mechanisms. First is transport using protein carriers or protein pumps. Now this is probably the type of active transport that you're most familiar with from IGCSE biology, and you could have seen it in the instance of uptake of mineral ions from the soil water, in root hair cells, or even transport of glucose into the cell by active transport in the epithelial cells of the villi of the small intestine. And you could have heard it in the instance where we say, oh, we're transporting specific molecules or specific ions across the concentration gradient, across the membrane, against the concentration gradient from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration using energy in the form of ATP. You probably would have heard it in that sort of package sentence in IGCSE biology. Second type of active transport that we're going to look at is vesicular transport, and this is the case where we have endocytosis or exocytosis of specific materials kind of entrapped within vesicles, moving across the membrane either into the cell or out of the cell. Last type of active transport is co-transport, and this is a type of indirect active transport. Pretty much the definition of active transport is any type of transport mechanism that requires energy. So particles moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration would also be a case of active transport as it requires energy. In this specific video, we'll be looking into the case of the sodium-potassium pump, which qualifies for the first instance, the first type of active transport with protein carriers or pumps. Now, in the case of the sodium-potassium pump, we're going to have the sodium-potassium pump bind 3 sodium ions and 1 molecule of ATP. And so we're going to have these 3 sodium ions bind to the sodium-potassium pump and 1 molecule of ATP. Just to kind of remind you, ATP is a molecule consisting of adenosine and 3 phosphates. That's why the full name is adenosine triphosphate. Now, the splitting of the ATP molecule is going to provide energy to change the shape of the sodium-potassium pump. And so the sodium ions are driven through the channel. It's through the splitting of ATP, and when the ATP molecule splits, it's going to split to 1 inorganic phosphate ion, right here, and adenosine diphosphate, also known as ADP. And this is basically saying that we've kind of detached the single phosphate ion from what was a package of adenosine and 3 phosphate. So we're going to have adenosine and 2 phosphates bonded together. Now, third process, the sodium ions are then going to be released to the outside of the membrane, and now the shape of the channel is going to allow the other 2 potassium ions to bind. So we've gotten a change in the shape of the sodium-potassium pump, and the sodium ions are going to be transported from where they were originally, from inside the cell to outside of the cell across the membrane. And instead, we're going to have 2 potassium ions bind to the sodium-potassium pump. In our last process, we're going to have the release of the phosphate ion, which was originally binded right here, and this is going to be released, and this is going to allow the channel or the sodium-potassium pump to revert back to its original form, and this is going to release the potassium ion from inside of the pump, and it's going to go inside, across the membrane and inside into the cell. Now, the sodium-potassium pump is a membrane protein that functions to actively transport sodium ions towards outside of the cell and potassium ions into the cell, as we have seen above. And the sort of transport currency rate, or the exchange rate for the sodium ions and the potassium ions, is 3 sodium ions for every 2 potassium ions. And we're going to obtain energy from the hydrolysis of ATP into 1 inorganic phosphate ion and adenosine diphosphate, also known as ADP. This is pretty much just a written outline of what I have explained further earlier. And in today's video, to sum up, we've explored the sodium-potassium pump, which counts for a case of active transport with protein carriers or pumps.